Well, will anybody join me? I wonder. I have my cocktail. If you haven't gotten your cocktail yet, please go get it. Because it's happy hour on Sunday. Let me see what it looks like with light on. See if it enhances it or not. Ooh, we have a viewer. Oh, that adds a little warmth to it. Okay. All right, so welcome to our Sunday happy hour. Every Sunday at 5 o'clock, we are going to be reading a little bit from the history of Rye. This is written by L.B. Parsons, who happens to be my great-grandfather. Back in... Oh, okay, I think we lost it for a second. Anyway, so I have chosen... Hi, Andrea. I have chosen to read Discovery and Settlement. So it's longer than 20 minutes, which is what I wanted to keep this to. So I've paraphrased a lot of little parts. So Discovery and Settlement. Although Rye was not set off from Portsmouth and Newcastle as a separate parish or township by the provincial legislature until 1726, and indeed was not wholly separated from Newcastle politically until after the Revolutionary War, yet it is proper in writing its history to commence with the earliest history of the state, for the first building erected by white men within the boundaries of what is now the state of New Hampshire was put up, and the first soil of which there is authentic record that it was trodden by white men is now within the boundaries of this town. And it is not certain that one of the earliest exploring vessels, long before any settlement was made on the shores of the Piscataqua, did not anchor for a time in Rye Harbor. A daring venture indeed it was 300 years ago, when those old maritime explorers set sail from Europe in little ships that could be stowed by the half dozen in the hold of an ocean liner of the present day in search of unknown lands in unknown seas. Now the coasts of all civilized countries are minutely charted, and the coasts of all countries fairly charted from running surveys. The navigator knows just where to look for a rock, an island, or a continent, and science has devised many instruments and appliances for his aid. Then, when the mariner set sail from home, he had neither chart of the seas to which he was going, chronometer, nor nautical almanac. His aids were the compass, the spyglass, and the sounding lead, and all he could be sure of was that he would meet with many surprises and have to do many things he did not plan to do when starting, before arriving home again. And as the coast explored was wholly unknown, of course its notable features were unnamed, so the adventurer, in describing his discoveries, had no definite point to start them, and from this cause many places mentioned by the early explorers cannot be positively identified now. Who's here? Let's see. Debbie! Hi, Debbie! So I'm going to take a break right there and just do a little synopsis. So the first people who came over in 1603 were merchants from Bristol, England, or merchants in Bristol, England formed a company to explore the coast with two ships, the Speedwell and the Discoverer. They hired a 23-year-old Martin Pring as captain, and he actually went fairly far up the Piscataqua. In the summer of 1605, the coast of New England was explored by Samuel de Champlain, from France. So back to the book. Champlain undoubtedly discovered the Isles of Shoals, but he was not the first white man to discover them, for Martin Pring could not possibly have entered and departed from Piscataqua without seeing them, nor could Pring's predecessors, if such there were. But it is in the account of Champlain's voyages that they are first mentioned. Champlain was along this coast again in the fall of 1606, and from statements in the story of his two voyages, written by himself, at least one earnest and critical student of New England's early history, the late Thaddeus William Harris, former librarian of Harvard College, became convinced that on the second voyage his ship, commanded by Captain Poutrincourt, anchored for a time in Rye Harbor. Among the papers of the late Thomas J. Parsons of Rye was found the following letter from Professor Harris, who had previously written to Mr. Parsons' father, the late Dr. John Wilkes Parsons, a letter that arrived after the doctor's death and which was answered by his son. The letter to Thomas J. Parsons, which explains itself and gives interesting information concerning Champlain's second voyage, of which little, if anything, has ever been published in this country, is here given in full and will repay careful reading. All right, so if you have your cocktail, this is kind of a long letter. Okay, Cambridge, Mass., April 3rd, 1850. Dear Sir, your favor of the 30th ultimately reached me this morning, and I am much obliged to you for the interesting information communicated. I ventured to address my letter to your father because he was of the medical profession to which also I was bred, not being aware of his decease, for his name was in the New Hampshire Register of 1849 as a physician and a magistrate, and I've always found such to be the most intelligent generally and most ready to communicate information. Notwithstanding the difference of appearance in the sketch with which you have favored me, I am strongly inclined to the belief that Rye Harbor was Champlain's Beauport. But as you have been so obliging in your communication, I will venture to state the grounds that lead me to this conclusion, and to add some items translated from the very interesting narrative of Champlain's voyages in 1605 and 1606, with the Sieurs de Mons and Poutrincourt, whom he accompanied, and the account of which was written by himself. In the first voyage along the coast from Port Royal, now Annapolis, Nova Scotia, after having visited Saco and Cape Porpoise, de Mons was pursuing his course southerly along the shore when, on the 15th of July, 1605, towards sunset, he could find no suitable place in which to anchor for the night because the coast was flat and sandy. Standing away from the land towards the south, he saw a point on the mainland 6 leagues distant, south and a quarter southwest. 2 leagues to eastward were 3 or 4 pretty high islands, the Isles of Shoals, and at the west a great inlet, which Champlain on his map called Bay Long, 3 or 4 leagues in extent. At the entrance there were 2 large islands, north and south of it, Garish Islands and Great Island, covered with trees, and another that was low, on which the waves broke a little farther out to sea, and on which there were no trees, White Island or Hogsback. The place being unsuitable for anchorage, they kept off and on the shore under light sail till towards daybreak, when they came to anchor in 16 fathoms water near the before-named cape, which they named the Cape of Islands. They're thinking Odierns Point? And they found the latitude 43 degrees and some minutes north. I judge from the description and from the maps that Bay Long was Piscataqua Harbor, into which Champlain has represented a river flowing, which he calls the Charente. On the 16th, they went on shore at the point or cape, where they saw Indians and made them some presents of knives and biscuits. Here there were abundance of vines, the berries of which were not much larger than peas, and nut trees with nuts about as big as musket balls. The ground was well cultivated, as at Saco, and other places that they had visited. From this place they sailed along southerly, passing rocks and sandy shores, till they came to several islands covered with trees and inhabited by numerous Indians, and the wind being favorable, they reached Cape Ann, by them named Cape St. Louis, on the 17th of July, having in the voyage from Bay Long passed by a large river called by them Riviere du Gaz, which was barred at the mouth before reaching the cape. The Dugaz I take to be the Merrimack, from the bar at its mouth, and the islands which they passed, Plum Island and the islands in Squam Bay. Having brought de Mons and Champlain thus far, I will take up the next voyage by Poutrincourt and Champlain along the same coast, bringing them to Saco on the 21st of September, 1606, where they made some stop, and thence continued the voyage to the Cape of Islands, where they were overtaken by bad weather and fogs, and were unable to find any good harbor for the night. While they were in this trouble, Champlain recollected that in the previous voyage, as they were coasting along shore, he had observed a place which had the appearance of being a good harbor, but which they did not enter, as the wind was favorable for their voyage. Having mentioned it to Poutrincourt, while they were about sailing by it again, he indicated a certain point of land which he advised Poutrincourt to stand in for, and where they cast anchor near the entrance of the harbor he had noticed. This place they called Beauport, and it is represented on the map as southerly of the Cape of Islands. And on the little plan, a copy of which I sent to you, Champlain has represented on the northwest corner a portion of water, which in the explanation he says is the sea or water of a bay as you turn around the Cape of Islands, corresponding, I imagine, with Little Harbor. In a rapid voyage of this kind, supplied as they were with only the very imperfect nautical instruments used at that time in coasting voyages, perfect accuracy in the maps and plans is not to be expected. Besides, on a coast like this, great changes may be expected to take place in the course of 244 years. Indeed, at Cape Cod, very remarkable changes have occurred, even within the memory of man, at Nauset and Chatham harbors, which now would hardly be recognized by the maps made 100 years ago. Poutrincourt and his companions passed several days at Beauport, which they did not leave till the morning of the 30th of September to go to Cape St. Louis, or Cape Ann. They stated that the latitude of Beauport was 43 degrees, the Cape of Islands, according to their calculations, being 43 degrees and some minutes. This again, if the so-named cape was Odiern's Point, shows that Beauport must have been Rye Harbor. The greatest difficulty that I find is to account for the entire disappearance of the little island and promontory behind which Poutrincourt's small vessel was anchored. The rocky islet in the sea was perhaps the rocks off Rocky Shore. If we suppose that at high water the sea covered most of the ground indicated in your plan as thatch ground and salt marsh, the resemblance will be much increased. Goss Mill may well occupy the creek or stream running through a meadow represented on Champlain's plan. On the original, there are cabins and cornfields all along to the south of this creek, extending perhaps to what you call the highland or Lock's Neck. There were likewise other cabins and patches of corn on the other side of the harbor, near Sandy Beach. The extremity of the tongue of land on the easterly side of the harbor, Champlain on his map called Rocky Point, answering to your Ragged Neck, perhaps. The rest of this tongue, he said, was full of yellow flowers, goldenrod, nut trees, and vines. In a little creek near the northern extremity or base of this tongue, the sailors washed their clothes and spread them on the bank to dry and whiten in the sun. While they were thus engaged, Champlain had strolled away from them and suddenly perceived a large party of Indians, armed with bows and arrows, coming across the marsh, apparently to cut him off and to surprise his companions. But Poutrincourt and 7 or 8 men armed with muskets were concealed behind some trees, and hearing Champlain, came out upon the Indians, who immediately fled in all directions. Before this event, the Indians had appeared very friendly, having visited the French while they were caulking their boat near the neck, and having exchanged for such small presents as they received the produce of their country. One woman above 100 years old came to Poutrincourt and laid at his feet a cake made of maize and a great quantity of very good ripe grapes. The French found here, besides the corn, which the Indians were then harvesting, great quantities of beans, winter squashes, and pumpkins, and the tuberous sunflower, which the Indians cultivated for the roots, which had the taste of artichokes and were good to eat. The trees in this place were walnuts, cypress, sassafras, oaks, ashes, and beeches. There were above 200 savages in the place. But my paper will hold out no further. Please excuse the haste in which I have been obliged to write, and believe me to be very truly your much obliged Thaddeus William Harris. So this letter contains the first and only suggestion we have ever seen that Champlain, on his second voyage to this coast, anchored in Rye Harbor. That he did so is not inherently improbable, for the exploring ships of Champlain's time were much smaller than the American fishing schooners of the present day. But whether he did or not, it is accepted by historians that on his first voyage he landed upon what is now called Odiorn's Point. Okay, here is where I'm going to go off from the book and just do a little paraphrasing. But it's happy hour, so I'm going to have a sip first. Hope you do too. Okay, so just to synopsize a little bit. Once this all happened, actually, before I do that, I want to give you just a little footnote here, because we're going to be talking about Hubbard, Reverend Nathaniel Hubbard, who was ordained minister at Ipswich, Mass. In 1658 and died in 1704, left a manuscript history which was published many years later. It touched upon the settlement of New Hampshire to but a limited extent, and contained much that later research has shown to be inaccurate, notwithstanding which it is a work of value. So anyway, I just wanted to give that footnote because there is a lot of mention of Hubbard later on. I just got a new dog. So that's Roxy. Not sure who she's barking at. Okay, so now the next person to come was Captain John Smith in 1614. Oh no, yes, Captain John Smith in 1614. Wait, I thought it was, yeah. And he named the Isles of Shoals Smith Isles. He drew the first map made by an Englishman and brought it back to Prince Charles, who gave the territory the name New England. In 1620, Plymouth Council was established to govern the area. Then in spring of 1623, the Jonathan of Plymouth, a boat, arrived at the Piscataqua with the first party of settlers. David Thompson was their leader. There they built houses at Little Harbor that were, they found that was a really good place to do this. And Little Harbor, they're saying, is like the whole Odiorn Point area. It was easily defensible from savages. It had a good harbor. It had fine spring water on the shore. And they named the new plantation Panaway. So there's been much discussion of the Panaway House in this book, in this chapter, and I'm not going all into it. If you're interested in it, you want to get the book. And as David Thompson, in the book, and as David Thompson's wife had come with him, they had the firstborn in New Hampshire, John. Well, at least the firstborn white person. Panaway became a destination for travelers, including Phineas Pratt, Mr. Thomas Weston, Captain Miles Standish, Captain Christopher Levitt, and many others. There are some stories that you hear about Hilton's Point and Dover being settled at the same time, but these are based on one statement by Hubbard, and he's been painted as somewhat not reliable, because apparently if you look at the people who supposedly, the Hiltons who populated that area, in 1624, they were still in England. So anyway, in 1627, Thompson left Panaway for the Massachusetts Bay, and he died shortly after. John Mason, who was with the Laconia Company, they took over the Panaway House and renamed it Mason Hall, though again, there's some dissension with the Hubbard account. Captain Walter Neal, who was governor of the Laconia Company, he took up residency there. And let's see, and then I was going to go back to the book. So that was all happening. So there's a lot of intrigue, a lot of going back and forth. And so getting back to this. How are we doing on time? Oh, good. With all the intrigues, plots, wrongs, and oppressions of those early days, a history of Rye is not concerned. But the reader of New Hampshire history should bear in mind that the state was not founded by the Puritans, nor by John Mason, or the Company of Laconia, of which he was a member. A permanent settlement had already taken root on its soil before the bark Warwick first appeared in the waters of the Piscataqua, and that settlement was in what is now the town of Rye. So now there's a little section called History, and it's just the last little section of the book, and of the chapter, I thought it would wrap it up nicely. Hubbard says that at the Little Harbor, it is supposed the first house was set up that was ever built in those parts. The chimney and some parts of the stone wall are standing at this day in 1680, and certainly was it which was called, then or soon after, Mason Hall, because to it was annexed 3,000 or 4,000 acres of land with intention to erect a manor or lordship there, according to the custom of England. For by consent of the rest of the undertakers, in some after divisions, that parcel of land fell to his share, and it is mentioned at his property in his last will and testament by the name of Mason Hall. By the first house, subsequent writers have supposed that the first habitation was intended, and that a large mansion was built by Thompson on his landing, the same that was subsequently occupied by Neal in 1630 and known as Mason Hall. Hubbard gives countenance to this idea so far as to say that the agents of Sir Ferdinando Georges and Captain Mason, with the rest, had by their order built a house and done something about salt works sometime before the year 1630. Hubbard infers the agency of Georges and Mason from the mention of a house and salt works as already on the place in the indenture cited 3rd November 1631. There seems to be some evidence that the agents of the Company of Laconia occupied a house at Piscataqua that had been built before they came over. In a deposition of William Seavey, aged about 75 years in 1676, he said he came over to the Isles of Shoals upon a fishing account about a year before Neal left the country in 1633, and he was credibly informed that Neal, when he came over in 1630, lived in a house in Little Harbor of Piscataqua, which by common report was built by some merchants, etc., of Plymouth, England. Also, in a recital made by the Council of New Hampshire in 1681, consisting of Richard Waldron, president, and others who were opposed to Mason's claim, they say that the vast expanse of estate, as claimed to have been made by John Mason in the settlement of New Hampshire, is mostly, if not merely, a pretense. A house was hired in this province, but the disbursements laid out were on the other side of the river, province of Maine, M-E-Y-N, and for carrying on an Indian trade in Laconia, in which his grandfather was but a partner. However, he would appear amongst us as sole proprietor. That Thompson, during his 3 years' residence at Little Harbor, by assistance of his partners, built a large house there and left it. But that Thompson, or any one after him, built a house there known as Mason Hall is extremely improbable. Hubbard evidently got his notion of Mason Hall from Mason's will, made shortly before his death, in which he designates his whole grant of New Hampshire as my county of New Hampshire, or Mason Hall, or in another place, my county of New Hampshire, or manor of Mason Hall. Mason wrote to Gibbons in 1634, I have dispersed a great deal of money in the plantation and never received 1 penny, but hope if there were a discovery of the lakes that I should in some reasonable time be reimbursed again. In a statement of Robert Mason's claim in 1674-75, reference is made to John Mason's various franchises, afterwards enlarged and called New Hampshire. Were it not for the accidental circumstances of the prosecution of this claim, thus bringing forward a name used in John Mason's patent, it is not improbable that New Hampshire would have rejoiced today in the old euphonious Indian name of Piscataqua, by the appointment of a commission for the government of the territory as a royal province in 1679, the name of New Hampshire became fixed upon the place. So for those 2 people who are here watching with me, Andrea and Debbie, I love you dearly. That was the first chapter of the history of Rye. I found it kind of fascinating. It's more, I took a lot of notes here when the synopsizing. Anyway, so if you are watching this after the fact, next Sunday we will have another chapter read by another board member of the Rye Historical Society, and I hope everybody is staying very safe out there, and we're just trying to give people another option for being entertained and feeling connected in the community. So feel free to shoot us a line. Don't tell us what you didn't like, but tell us what you liked. And keep your eye out for some more things that we are going to be doing to help you connect with your town. All right, that's it. Have a great week. Ugh.